From 1750 to 1850, American homesteaders, especially those moving westward after the Revolution, needed to acquire a range of essential goods and services to establish and maintain their farms. While many items were produced on-site through subsistence farming, critical tools, materials, and services had to be purchased or bartered from external producers, often at great expense and logistical difficulty. Homesteaders required a variety of physical goods to build homes, cultivate land, and sustain their families. Plows, hoes, axes, scythes, horses, oxen, cows, chickens, and pigs were essential for labor, food, and breeding. Lumber, nails, glass, and hardware for constructing homes, barns, and fences. Early settlers often used sod due to lack of timber. Cast iron stoves, cookware, oil lamps, textiles, and furniture all had to be purchased. Seeds and fertilizer necessary for crop cultivation often had to be bought when local supplies were insufficient. While many grew their own corn, beans, and wheat, staple items like salt, sugar, coffee, and spices were typically purchased. In addition to tangible goods, homesteaders depended on several critical services. Wagons and later railroads were vital for moving supplies in and crops out. Before the expansion of rail networks, transportation was slow and costly. Blacksmithing was essential for repairing tools, shoeing horses, and fabricating metal parts. Grain mills were needed to process corn and wheat into flour. Farmers often borrowed money to buy land, tools, and livestock, and relied on banks despite high interest rates. Though medical care was often limited, some settlers paid for doctors or midwives, especially during childbirth or illness. The production of these goods and services came from a mix of local artisans, emerging industries, and distant manufacturers. Local blacksmiths and carpenters provided custom tools, repairs, and construction help within frontier communities. Many finished goods like stoves, textiles, and advanced farm tools were produced in industrializing regions of the Northeast or imported from Eastern and European manufacturers. Merchants and general stores acted as intermediaries, selling goods brought in via wagon trains or later railroads. Banks and financial institutions, mostly located in towns and cities, provided loans and credit, though often at prohibitive rates for small farmers. By the mid-19th century, railroads became crucial in transporting both people and goods, though they initially charged high freight rates. Despite the availability of land, especially after the Homestead Act of 1862, the cost of starting a farm was steep. It could take close to $1,000 to purchase the necessary supplies, a significant sum when most families lived hand-to-mouth. Many would-be landowners ended up as migrant laborers, working for wages on larger farms because they couldn't afford the startup costs. Moreover, market forces often worked against small farmers. As more settlers produced crops, prices fell, while the cost of borrowed money and transported goods remained high. This economic pressure contributed to the rise of large bonanza farms and fueled agrarian unrest later in the century. The image of the early American settler as a completely self-sufficient, independent yeoman is largely a myth. While homesteaders were indeed industrious, their survival and economic viability were deeply entangled with credit networks, merchants, and market dependencies from the very beginning. The romanticized notion of the self-reliant pioneer obscures the reality that even the earliest settlers required capital, credit, and external goods to establish a farm. From axes and plows to seeds and cookware, essential tools had to be purchased or bartered, tying settlers immediately to a cash or credit economy. Credit was the lifeblood of colonial and early American frontier economies. Studies of merchant account books from the 18th century show that over 98% of purchases in places like Connecticut and Massachusetts were made on credit, not with cash or barter. Settlers relied on book credit. Local merchants extended credit to farmers, who paid back debts after harvest. Colonial merchants depended on international credit from British suppliers to stock their shelves. In later decades, especially after the Civil War, merchants held crop liens or legal claims on future harvests as collateral for credit. This system meant that financial privilege, or at least access to a trustworthy merchant, was often the difference between success and failure. Establishing a farm was expensive. In 1843, Illinois, the cost to buy, fence, and improve just 80 acres of land was nearly $1,278, excluding the cost of livestock and tools. Adding a pair of oxen, a wagon, and basic implements could push total startup costs well over $1,500, a prohibitive sum for most families without savings or credit. Many would-be homesteaders could not afford these costs and instead became tenant farmers or migrant laborers, working for wages on larger estates. This economic stratification demonstrates that land ownership was not equally accessible. It favored those with capital or strong credit connections. The general store was more than a shop. It was the economic and social hub of frontier life. Storekeepers acted as bankers by extending credit and tracking debts in ledger books, as merchants by supplying goods that couldn't be produced on site like salt, coffee, nails, or textiles, and as community leaders by mediating disputes, delivering news, and connecting isolated families to the wider world. For many settlers, the general store was their only link to the market economy, reinforcing their dependency on external suppliers just as modern consumers rely on global supply chains. Far from being isolated islands of self-sufficiency, early American homesteaders were deeply embedded in economic networks of credit, trade, and dependency. Access to land and resources was heavily influenced by finance and privilege, challenging the myth of the wholly independent pioneer. Their reality mirrors modern economic interdependence, where survival and success depend on access to capital, supply chains, and community infrastructure. For many, the shift from feudal bondage to market dependency was a change in the mechanism of control, not necessarily the degree of freedom. While legal status changed, economic coercion often replicated the constraints of serfdom. The primary distinction between the frontier and feudalism lies in the method of enforcement. Feudal serfs were bound by law and physical force. They could not leave the land without permission. In contrast, homesteaders were legally free but bound by debt and economic necessity. However, historians argue this distinction is often negligible in practice. The crop lien system, prevalent post-Civil War but rooted in earlier credit practices, trapped farmers in cycles of debt where they effectively worked for merchants rather than themselves. Like serfs, they could not leave without forfeiting their livelihood, and their labor's value was dictated by creditors who set both the price of supplies and the value of the crop. This created a state of debt peonage, where the freedom to contract masked a reality of economic enslavement. Market control over prices meant a loss of autonomy over the value of one's labor. In a free market dominated by monopolies like a single general store or railroad, prices were not negotiated but dictated. Price fixing was common as merchants often inflated the cost of goods while depressing the price paid for crops, capturing the surplus value of the farmer's labor. High interest rates on credit functioned similarly to feudal rent, extracting wealth from the producer without their consent to the terms. For most farmers, there was a lack of alternatives. With no competing buyers or sellers, the freedom to choose was illusory. The farmer had to accept the terms offered or starve. This dynamic mirrors the feudal relationship where the lord controlled the mill, the oven, and the market, ensuring the peasant remained subservient regardless of their legal status. Proponents of the frontier myth argue that settlers could simply move west if conditions were unfavorable. However, this safety valve required capital, money for wagons, tools, and new land. For those already in debt, mobility was impossible. Just as serfs were tied to the land by law, Indebted homesteaders were tied by financial obligation. The threat of foreclosure, loss of equipment, or legal action, including imprisonment for debt in earlier periods, served as a powerful deterrent to leaving, effectively binding them to their creditors. If freedom is defined as control over the fruits of one's labor, then the distinction between a serf bound by law and a farmer bound by debt is indeed slim. Both systems concentrated power in the hands of a few lords or merchants who dictated the terms of survival. The frontier did not eliminate hierarchy or exploitation, it merely privatized it, replacing the lord's whip with the banker's ledger. In this view, the free market was not a realm of liberty, but a new architecture of control, where financial privilege replaced hereditary title as the determinant of power.